The book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis has become one of the most respected and revered books of the 20th century. When Lewis delivered this content through broadcast talks on the BBC over 70 years ago, he probably never imagined the lasting impact it would have on so many people, both Christians and non-Christians alike. In this 8-session study entitled Discussing Mere Christianity, we'll unpack the words that Lewis wrote and begin to understand why mere Christianity has helped so many people over the last century understand the Christian faith in new and powerful ways. As prosperous and vibrant as London, England is today, it's hard to imagine that just 70 years ago its very existence hung in the balance. As the German war machine pounded London day and night, the British people's resolve was stretched to a breaking point. The country needed a message of hope and stability found in timeless truths to calm the tumultuous waves of uncertainty. That message was found in the most unassuming of places. A short walk down a dirt pathway just north of Oxford, England, home to Oxford University, will lead you to a home known as the Kilns, aptly named for its proximity to a stone quarry. This unassuming cottage-like home belonged to the college professor and mostly unknown writer C.S. Lewis. In February 1941, long before Narnia, before Screwtape, or Mere Christianity, long before C.S. Lewis's fame had spread much beyond England, he received a letter in the mail which began like this.
Dear Mr. Lewis, I address you by name because, although we have never met, you cannot be a stranger after allowing me and many others to know some of your thoughts and convictions in your book, The Problem of Pain.
The letter was from James Welch, the director of religious broadcasting for the BBC. And though no one realized it at the time, the letter would mark a major turning point in Lewis's life.
I write to ask whether you would be willing to help us in our work of religious broadcasting. The microphone is a limiting and rather irritating instrument, but the quality of thinking and depth of conviction which I find in your book ought sure to be shared with a great many other people. And for any talk, we can be sure of a fairly intelligent audience of more than 1 million.
Welch then suggested 2 possible topics. The first was for Lewis to speak about the Christian or lack of Christian assumptions underlying modern literature. The other topic Welch proposed was a series of talks on something like the Christian faith as I see it by a layman. On February 10th, Lewis wrote back thanking Mr. Welch for his kind remarks. Noting that the first topic about modern literature did not suit him, Lewis agreed to try his hand at the second.
I think what I mainly want to talk about is the law of nature, or objective right and wrong. It seems to me that the New Testament, by preaching about repentance and forgiveness, always assumes an audience who believes in this law and knows that they have disobeyed it. In modern England, we cannot at present assume this. The first step is to create or recover the sense of guilt. Hence, if I give a series of talks, I should mention Christianity only at the end. Let me know what you think of this and how many talks and what dates you would like. Yours sincerely, C.S. Lewis.
With that letter, an assignment and relationship that would change the nature of Christian apologetics began. Only 6 months later, Lewis took the hour-long train ride from Oxford into London and then traveled on to the BBC headquarters for the first of 6 broadcasts. Each week, at precisely 7:45 in the evening, Lewis would spend 15 minutes making the case to an already secular and war-torn Great Britain about things like moral law and humanity and its relationship to something higher than itself. He was eloquent, insightful, even amusing. Lewis's radio talks proved to be a great success. His clear step-by-step reasoning, his honest and unassuming tone, and his use of common-sense examples drew in listeners of all types. The BBC asked Lewis to present a second series, and then a third, and finally a fourth. His popularity was such that a few surveys showed that his voice was one of the most recognized in Britain, second only to that of Winston Churchill. The broadcast talks, as they were initially called, were printed and published in separate volumes. Then, in 1952, they were collected into one volume and published as the book The World Knows as Mere Christianity. It became an instant classic. When the broadcast talks began, Lewis was nervous about how he was positioning himself on the radio. In one of the radio introductions, he explained to listeners,
"It's not because I'm anybody in particular that I've been asked to tell you what Christians believe. In fact, it's just the opposite. The British Broadcasting Corporation has asked me, first of all, because I'm a layman and not a parson, and consequently they thought I might understand the ordinary person's point of view a bit better. Secondly, I think they asked me because it was known that I'd been an atheist for many years and only became a Christian fairly recently. They thought that would mean I'd be able to see the difficulties, able to remember what Christianity looks like from the outside. One thing I can promise you, in spite of all the unfortunate differences between Christians, what they agree on is still something pretty big and pretty solid, big enough to blow any of us sky high if it happens to be true."
In our look at Mere Christianity, we'll be exploring not the issues that divide Christians, but the big solid issues that most Christians agree on. And we'll learn how Lewis, a former atheist who had dismissed Christian belief as an invention of delusional men, eventually embraced the very faith he'd argued against. In this session, we will look at our sense of right and wrong, a sense all of us have, which Lewis refers to as the law of human nature. And we will begin where Lewis began, not by starting off with complicated doctrines such as the Trinity or atonement, but with something each of us experiences nearly every day: a quarrel. Why did he start there? Because everyone has quarreled, or heard a quarrel where one person tries to convince someone else of what they should or shouldn't have done. Lewis points out that when two people argue about whether something is wrong or right, it means they have a common agreement about a moral standard or code. This was Lewis's foundation for the case he knew he had to make about a credible and real faith. He was speaking to a nation that had moved away from its Christian beliefs and was now immersed in war and bracing itself for possible invasion. He knew he had to begin with a shared sense of right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe.
What's the basis of morality? C.S. Lewis often thought about this. As a young man, he was an atheist and he was inclined to the view, look, there's no God, we can do what we like, we're not accountable to anyone or to anything. But when Lewis discovered Christianity, he began to realize that the Christian vision of God had rich moral implications, that morality was not something we invented, but rather it was something that was built into the deeper structure of things. And we find Lewis's most interesting discussion of this in his very famous book, Mere Christianity. And in that book, Lewis begins by saying, look, let's imagine people having a dispute about something. And Lewis makes the point that there has to be some higher authority, something to which they can appeal in order to resolve their dispute about what is right and what is wrong. And Lewis makes the point that this deep sense of moral intuition, that there is right, there is wrong, is fundamental to human nature. And one of the questions Lewis wants to explore is, well, what is the implications of this? And Lewis, of course, is going to make the point that God is the best explanation there is for this deep human awareness of there being right, there being wrong, but also that it's more than just there is right, there is wrong. There's something about us as well, namely that we have this deep sense of right and wrong, but also this inability to actually live up to our own standards of what is right and what is wrong. And in Mere Christianity, Lewis makes the point that our sense of right and wrong are very important clues to the meaning of the universe. Now, what does he mean by that? A clue is not something that proves something, but it's something that, when taken with other clues, builds up to give us a persuasive account of the way things are. And Lewis's argument really goes like this. He's saying, look, we have this deep sense of there being right and wrong. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but if Christianity is right, that's exactly what we'd expect. If there really is a God and this God is righteous, then we'd expect this deep inbuilt sense of there being right and there being wrong to be something we experience within us. And that's exactly what it is that we do experience. Now again, Lewis is not saying this proves there is a God, but he is saying it's absolutely consistent with what Christians think about God and with the Christian way of thinking about things. And you may know Lewis's very famous statement, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And the point that Lewis is making is that Christianity gives us this rich intellectual vision, which fits in so many things, including, of course, the sense of right and the sense of wrong. So where does this take us? Well, obviously it tells us something very important about human nature. Because for Lewis, we are always aware that we don't live up to our own standards of what is right and what is wrong. And Lewis will make the point that this helps us to realize that we are not the autonomous beings we'd like to think we are. We need help. If we're going to be good people, we need someone to make us good, because we can't do that on our own. And Lewis will go on to develop a very rich theology of grace, which is about God enabling us to become the people that we are meant to be. But I think the really important thing for our purposes in this conversation is this. Lewis is making it absolutely clear that this way of thinking about morality challenges some of the lazy and complacent ways of thinking about these questions which have become so characteristic of our culture. For example, morality is just about me doing what I think is right. Lewis is saying, no, you don't invent what's right and what's wrong. What you are trying to do is discern what is right and what is wrong. And these are not things that you invent. These are things that are built into who we are as people, the way the universe is, and they are grounded in and guaranteed by the God who made us in the first place. Or again, others might say, well, hey, okay, maybe we don't invent right and wrong, but maybe society does. That good is what society decides what is right. Well, again, Lewis would say, look, there are some very fundamental problems about that. That just means that right and wrong are things that are determined by those who are in positions of power. And Lewis's point is, look, you may be powerful, but that does not entitle you to decide what is right, what is wrong. These are things that are beyond you. These are things which we have to acknowledge, not things that we have to invent. Now, Lewis's thinking about all of this was deeply shaped by the Second World War. Many of Lewis's best apologetic writings were written during the period 1939 to 1945, when Britain was at war with Germany. And it brought home to Lewis, I think, something very important indeed, which was, look, the Nazis, they have their own ideas of what is right and what is wrong. How can we show that there is a deeper standard of what is right and what is wrong that allows us to say, look, that may be what you think, but you are not right in what you think. And for Lewis, if there is no God, then there is no supreme authority that allows us to say what you think is not of ultimate importance. Morality is not something that's grounded in what this individual or what this group of people think, but actually it's something that's much deeper than this. God is the transcendent ground of good. Now, during the Second World War, many things happened that I think reinforce the importance of what Lewis is saying. One very famous example arises from the Nazi period, where in effect, right was simply defined by what the state believed to be right. And many Germans were appalled by this and said, look, there has to be some way in which we can say this is wrong. And if there is no God, then there is no ultimate ground on which we can stand and say, this may be what you think, but it's not right. There is a higher authority which says something which you may try and ignore, but in the end, it says you are wrong. Now, in our own culture, we find many people saying, well, you know, I just do what I want. And that's fair enough in one sense. But there's this deeper question. Is what you want right? Or is there something deeper? Is this quest which all of us have to lead the good life, to be good people, simply by an ethic of human self-actualization, where I become the kind of person I want to be? Or is there something much more important, a God-given vision of what is right, and also what each of us is meant to be, and that we find fulfillment by becoming that kind of person? What Lewis is saying is that our deep intuition that there's something right and there's something wrong is really important. It's not something we've invented. It's something that is built into us by that action of God in creating each of us. And in many ways, the quest for morality is trying to discover what it is that God wants for His world, wants for each of us. It's an act of discernment. This is the way things are, and for Lewis, this moral vision is amplified by the Christian Bible and by the long tradition of Christian reflection on the biblical texts. So let's try and wrap this up. Lewis is offering a challenge to simple ideas about ethics which say, I do what I want. This society decides what is right and you've got to conform. Lewis is issuing a very powerful challenge to that by saying, look, whether you like it or not, there is something behind and beyond you. Right is not something you arbitrate. It's something that's already there. And in many ways, the supreme action of being human is to realize that we don't invent, we discover and we respond and try to live this out in our lives. Sure, it's difficult. And here Lewis comes in with this idea, which I think is of such importance. God doesn't just tell us what is right. He helps us to live out the good life. We aren't on our own. God graciously empowers us not simply to discover what is good, but to live out the good life.
Today, England is safe, prosperous, and peaceful, a country millions of tourists from all over the world visit each year. Looking around now, it's hard to believe that 75 years ago the nation was fighting for its very life. Few of us can appreciate the terror of the war. Beginning in September of 1940, London was relentlessly bombed by the German Air Force. The initial onslaught lasted for 57 consecutive nights and was interrupted only because of the weather. fires consumed much of the docks and city. More than 1 million houses were destroyed. Everyone was impacted, either suffering death or injury personally or knowing someone who had been. Each evening, Londoners drew their blackout curtains and sought shelter wherever they could, many fleeing to the closest underground tube station to wait out the night. Many parents, fearing for their children's lives, evacuated their sons and daughters out of the city to stay in the homes of friends or family, or in many cases in the homes of strangers in far-flung villages and towns. The kilns here became a haven for some of those children, which is a story we'll get to later. Not knowing if or when the bombing might spread, blackouts were strictly enforced in Oxford as well. The kilns was outfitted with its own set of thick gray curtains, and underneath a hill at the end of the pond beneath the house, Lewis had a bomb shelter constructed, and it remains there today. In Britain's darkest hour, the BBC turned to what seemed the most unlikely of men, an Oxford Don who had specialized in Renaissance literature. He addressed the nation and offered hope at a time when hope was in short supply. It was a time of great uncertainty, when an entire country needed to talk about important topics, about what was true, what was right and wrong, and what people believed and why they believed it. A time in many ways much like today. And Lewis began with a topic that is as relevant now as it was then. When we argue that some action is wrong, whether someone takes our seat on a bus or a country invades its neighbors, why do we say that it's wrong? Is there some objective law of right and wrong that all humans understand? And if there is, where did it come from? We'll take a look at Lewis's answer to this last question in our next session.